For generations, long before Nevada became a state, and decades before guano miners broke into a cave that would ignite one of the strangest debates in American archaeology, the Northern Paiute people preserved a dark and unusual tradition. They spoke of an enemy unlike any other, not a rival tribe, not a spirit or a symbol, but a people who lived among the Tule reeds of an ancient lake, a people the Paiute remembered as violent, strange in appearance, and, according to some accounts, marked by red hair. The Paiute called them the Sitika, and according to the tradition, the final battle against them ended at the mouth of a cave, where the last of these people were trapped inside, and the entrance was set on fire. For a long time, that story remained exactly what most outsiders assumed it was: a legend. Then, in 1911, two miners digging for bat guano in a remote cave above the Humboldt Sink began pulling artifacts out of the ground, thousands of them. And when archaeologists finally arrived, they found something no one expected, including human remains, some of them mummified, some of them reportedly with reddish hair. The cave was Lovelock Cave, and more than a century later, one question still hasn't gone away. Did the miners stumble into an ordinary prehistoric site, or into the very cave the Paiute had been describing all along? Today we're examining the historical records, the excavation reports, the newspaper accounts, and the Paiute oral tradition behind one of the most debated discoveries in the American West. To understand why Lovelock Cave still fascinates people, we have to begin long before 1911 with the people who knew this landscape first. The Northern Paiute lived for countless generations around the marshes and lakes of what is now western Nevada. Their world centered on water, on Pyramid Lake, on the Humboldt Sink, and on the vast wetlands left behind by an ancient lake that once covered much of the Great Basin. Geologists would later name it Lake La Hontan. And within Paiute oral tradition, one story stood apart. It described a people called the Sitika, a name often translated as Tule eaters, after the reeds that grew thick along the water. According to the tradition, the Sitika did not live like the Paiute. They built rafts of Tule reeds and kept to the water and the marshes, and they were remembered as hostile. So hostile that the surrounding peoples eventually united against them. Some versions of the tradition go further. They describe the Sitika as unusually large. Others remember them as having red or reddish hair, and several accounts describe something darker still, that they preyed on the people around them. Now, here is what makes this tradition different from an ordinary legend. It was written down before the cave was ever excavated. In 1883, a Paiute woman named Sarah Winnemucca, the daughter of a chief and one of the first Native American women to publish a book in English, recorded her people's history in a work called Life Among the Paiutes. In it, she described her people's long war against a barbarous enemy and how that war finally ended. The last of them were driven into a cave. The entrance was filled with wood and brush, and it was set alight. She even wrote that her family had kept a relic connected to those people, described as having reddish hair. Whatever anyone believes about the details, the timeline is not in dispute. The tradition was in print, in a published book, decades before anyone dug into Lovelock Cave, which means what happened next cannot be explained as a story invented after the fact. Lovelock Cave sits in a limestone outcrop above the Humboldt Sink, about 20 miles south of the small town of Lovelock, Nevada. From the outside, it looks unremarkable, a wide, low opening in a dry hillside. In 1911, two miners, James Hart and David Pugh, began working the cave for a very ordinary reason. It was filled with bat guano, valuable at the time as fertilizer. They stripped out tons of it and shipped it off for sale. But as they dug deeper, the guano gave way to something else. Layers of ash, woven baskets, sandals, tools, and human remains. The miners had no archaeological training, and by most accounts, the early digging destroyed a significant portion of the site. Artifacts were damaged, discarded, or carried off. But word of the finds eventually reached the University of California. And in 1912, an archaeologist named Llewellyn Loud was sent to investigate. What Loud documented was extraordinary by any standard. The cave had been used by human beings for thousands of years. Working through the deposits, Loud recovered roughly 10,000 artifacts and cataloged the site for the university's museum. And in 1924, a second, more systematic excavation followed, led by Mark Harrington on behalf of the Museum of the American Indian in New York. Together, the two excavations produced one of the richest archaeological collections ever recovered in the Great Basin. Textiles, nets, weapons, baskets so finely woven, they survived intact for millennia. And one category of artifact that would eventually become world famous: duck decoys, woven from tule reeds and feathers, so well preserved they looked almost usable. Decades later, scientific dating would show them to be roughly 2,000 years old, among the oldest known duck decoys anywhere on Earth. But it wasn't the baskets or the decoys that captured the public's imagination. It was the burials. The excavations recovered human remains, including mummified remains preserved by the dry desert air. And in the reports and newspaper coverage that followed, one detail kept resurfacing: hair described as red or reddish in color. To local readers, that detail landed like a thunderclap, because everyone in the region knew the Paiute story: a cave, a vanished people, red hair. The newspapers of the day did what newspapers of that era often did. The claims grew. Reports circulated of skeletons of enormous size, 6.5 feet, 7 feet, in some retellings, taller still. The phrase that attached itself to the site and never let go was simple and unforgettable: the red-haired giants of Lovelock Cave. So, what does the evidence actually show? This is where the story splits into two very different versions. And the difference between them matters. The cave is real and the excavations are real. Loud's 1912 work and the 1924 Harrington excavation are recorded in university and museum archives, and the collections still exist. Thousands of artifacts held in institutions, including the museum at Berkeley and the Nevada State Museum. The famous duck decoys are real, scientifically dated. The human remains are also documented, including mummified remains, and descriptions of reddish hair do appear in early accounts. But here, the record becomes more complicated. Hair pigment does not always survive burial unchanged. Researchers have long noted that black hair can turn reddish over centuries through chemical breakdown of pigment, a process documented at burial sites around the world. In other words, reddish hair on ancient remains is not by itself evidence of a red-haired people. It can be evidence of nothing more than time. Then there is the question of the giants. The excavation reports themselves, the actual documents produced by Loud and Harrington, describe the remains in ordinary human terms. The published measurements do not support a population of 7-foot giants. The towering skeletons belong to newspaper retellings and later folklore, not to the archaeological record. Some individuals may have been tall. Tall is not the same as giant. And yet, the story refused to die, partly because physical objects kept it alive. For decades, a small museum in Winnemucca, Nevada, displayed human remains said to come from the Lovelock area, and visitors reported seeing unusually large bones and artifacts. Photographs of oversized-looking objects circulated for years, often stripped of context. Skeptics pointed out that scale, provenance, and identification were rarely verifiable. In more recent decades, much of this material has moved out of public view as federal law, including the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, changed how institutions handle indigenous remains. For the Paiute, these were never museum curiosities. They were connected to their history and their dead. So strip away the exaggerations, and here's what remains. And it is still genuinely remarkable. A tradition published in 1883 describing a hostile people who ended their days trapped and burned in a cave. A cave excavated from 1912 onward, containing thousands of artifacts, human remains, and layers of ash. Harrington's excavation did document evidence of ancient fires within the cave. Caves used by humans for thousands of years often contain hearths and burn layers, and archaeologists caution that ash alone proves nothing about any single event. But the fact remains. The Paiute described a cave connected to fire and a vanished people, and the most famous cave in their territory turned out to contain both human remains and burned deposits, sealed under centuries of debris. Many researchers also suggest something subtler, that the CTCA tradition may preserve a genuine memory of real conflict between real groups in the distant past. A war remembered so vividly that it survived in oral tradition until it could be written down. Which raises the question that keeps this story alive. If the tradition preserved the memory of the war, did it also preserve the memory of the cave? More than a century has passed since Hart and Pugh first shoveled guano out of Lovelock Cave. In that time, the site has become one of the most studied and most argued about places in Great Basin archaeology. The artifacts recovered there transformed our understanding of how ancient peoples lived along the vanished shores of Lake Lahontan. The duck decoys alone rewrote assumptions about the sophistication of hunting technology 2,000 years ago. And yet the questions that surfaced in 1911 have never fully gone away. Because this story was never really about giants. Strip that word away and what's left is more interesting than any tabloid headline. An oral tradition carried for generations and written down in 1883 described a specific kind of event: a war, an enemy, a cave, a fire. Decades later, a cave in that same landscape yielded human remains, burned layers, and artifacts spanning thousands of years. The oral tradition came first. The excavation came second. That sequence is documented, and no serious researcher disputes it. What remains unresolved is what the connection means. Skeptics see a legend that later became attached to an impressive archaeological site, with newspapers inflating the rest. And they may be right. Others see something else, an indigenous historical record that preserved the memory of real events across a span of time that written history cannot reach. And that was dismissed as myth right up until the ground itself began producing evidence. There is precedent for that second possibility. Around the world, researchers have found oral traditions that accurately preserved memories of events hundreds or even thousands of years old. Coastlines that drowned at the end of the Ice Age, volcanic eruptions, battles, and migrations. Oral history, carefully kept, can carry truth across distances that seem impossible. Whether the story of the Sitika belongs in that category is a question the evidence has not settled. The bones that might have answered it have largely returned to darkness, repatriated, restricted, or lost in the chaos of those early guano mining years. But that the oldest histories of this continent were never written on paper. They were spoken, and every so often, the ground reminds us that some of those spoken histories may have been describing real places and real events all along. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through excavation records, historical newspapers, and indigenous traditions, consider subscribing. There are more investigations like this on the way. And before you go, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think the story of the CTCA and the discoveries at Lovelock Cave are unrelated? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next documentary.